All right, good afternoon and hello everyone. I'm Radu Kalinescu. I'm professor of computer science at the University of York and the principal investigator on the research project organizing this seminar series on the resilience of autonomous systems. And I'm really delighted to introduce today's speaker, Bev Townsend. Bev is a postdoctoral research associate at the York Law School. She is a member of the research team for the York-led Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Node in Resilience, and has pursued and published research on digital health, human rights, data protection, ethics, software as medical devices, AI, and medical regulation. She is also a member of the World Health Organization's Working Group for the Regulation of AI in Global Health. And today, Bev will be telling us about her work on the project I mentioned with the title From Pluralistic Normative Principles to Autonomous Agent Rules. Please, Bev.
Thank you, Radu, and good afternoon, everyone. So this work has been a collaborative effort, and it culminated in a paper entitled From Pluralistic Normative Principles to Autonomous Agent Rules, as Radu described. And happily, it was published in Minds and Machines last month. So I will describe the work now. Essentially, what we do is we bridge the gap between normative principles, so high-level normative principles, and operational practice. And what we did was we developed a process to move from these high-level set of SLEEC norms. And if you don't know yet, SLEEC is social, legal, ethical, empathetic, and cultural normative principles to operational, practical set of specification rules. And what our aims were essentially was firstly to identify these high-level norms and principles and the sources of these principles, and then to offer and defend a rule elicitation process that derives these SLEEC rules from SLEEC norms and principles, and to demonstrate how this might be achieved using an example, which was the assisted care dressing agent, which was under development in Sheffield. And essentially what we do is we offer a process to derive encoded specification SLEEC rules underpinned by a set of high-level normative principles, which then provide the reasons for a course of action to be followed by the agent. All right, so why are rules written? Okay, so autonomous systems are no longer what can be considered ethically blind. In other words, they do not function within a normative vacuum, but exist within a specific social, legal, cultural, and ethical milieu. And they are increasingly being called upon to execute normatively relevant decision-making or moral choices. So these SLEEC rules then can guide the development, the verification, the deployment, the operation, and the maintenance of an autonomous system, so that it may be considered to be at least somewhat ethically sensitive or ethically aware or SLEEC aware, and in some crucial legal senses, perhaps even SLEEC legally compliant. And the rules are used to augment or complement the functional requirements and specifications of what an agent ought to do and in what order. But by no means are we creating any kind of form of a moral machine, only that we are creating some kind of socio-technical system that can be considered SLEEC aware. And I think that's really important. So I think important to discuss who writes these rules. So we envisage that the rules will be informed by stakeholder participation in some kind of dialogical and participatory process or collaborative engagement, which involves deliberative and meaningful consultation with the various stakeholders. And these stakeholders could be users, they could be domain experts such as carers or health practitioners. They could be user advocacy groups, developers and designers, ethicists, philosophers and lawyers, but then also community leaders, because remember, we're not only writing legal and ethical rules, we're also writing SLEEC rules that are social and cultural. So we would look towards community leaders and members of the public as well to establish what those social rules might be, or the content of the social rules might be. And this suggested dialogical and participatory approach of involving stakeholders to embed the normative principles in the rule writing informs an integral part of responsible research and innovation. So essentially what happens is the rules provide the scaffolding upon which the autonomous system can execute normatively relevant and sensitive tasks. And these normative principles and some sense of morality really provide the content for the SLEEC rules. Okay, so when are the rules written? They're written at design stage, and I think this is very important. And they intended integration within existing requirements engineering methodologies. And this is to support the elicitation of SLEEC rules alongside other categories of non-functional requirements that are essential for high integrity autonomous systems. Okay, so what has our approach been? Our approach has been firstly to adopt a pluralist, particularist, non-prioritist, principled, and specificationist approach. So what does this mean? This essentially means that we look at a plurality of principles, in other words, very many principles. We believe that ethical judgment cannot be captured by a finite set of finite principles. And then by non-prioritist, what we believe is we do not prioritize or rank the principles a priori, but we may rank them later on after we've resolved the conflicts. And what we do here is we essentially undergo a process of deriving context-specific standards from these principles, and we believe it to be both top-down and bottom-up, by identifying both the high-level principles and then the lower-level evaluative standards, or SLEEC rules. We call them SLEEC rules. And in practice, this derivation, of course, of these such rules is very complex. So we don't, we just really offer a first attempt at describing how these SLEEC requirements, underpinned by these high-level principles and then specified by the rules, might be articulated in a given context. And essentially what our whole paper is really is just, our objective is just to demonstrate an initial proof of concept. Okay, so what is the process? Of course, we have a 5-stage process. The first stage is to identify these high-level rules, and I'll go through each one of the stages as we go along. The second stage is to identify what we refer to as proxies or placeholders. And then we also identify the system capabilities, and then we map the former to the latter, and we write our preliminary rules. And once we've done that, we move to the next stage, which is to identify any SLEEC concerns. And if we find SLEEC concerns, we identify and resolve any SLEEC conflicts. And then our last stage is to refine the rules and write complex rules, which consist of the preliminary rule plus single or multiple defeaters. And once that's been done, we loop back round and then re-identify any further SLEEC concerns. And we continue to do this until such time as we don't find any further SLEEC concerns, and then we stop the process. But I will describe it in detail now. It's quite a lengthy discussion. So I just have a sip of water. The first stage, remember, is to identify the normative principles. So remember, we said that the normative principles are pluralistic. So in other words, there are lots of different a plural set of principles. And we differentiate between these high-level normative principles and the rules. And these high-level normative principles may be things such as dignity, autonomy, accountability, justice, benevolence. And essentially what they are is that they're at a high level of abstraction, and they guide the conduct of the moral agents in a general way. And they apply across a wide range of domains. Whereas the rules, which on the other hand, These are more explicitly formulated standards and operational instructions. They build on the principles. In fact, they draw from the principles. So they embody the essence or the spirit of the high level principle, and they give principles some kind of practical import. They are much narrower in scope, and they're specifically context dependent, and they're intended to shape the actions, the conduct, and the choice of the agent. So once we understand the difference between these principles and then the lower level rules, we might want to know what these normative principles might be. And in fact, there are very many different types of normative principles, including things such as respect for human autonomy, benevolence or beneficence, in other words, doing good and preventing harm, justice and fairness, explainability and transparency, or some kind of notion of a right to be informed, responsibility and accountability, maximizing good outcomes or utility. And then we also look to principles that sort of form the bedrock of a new type of ethics of care or virtue ethics. In other words, things such as kindness, tolerance, empathy, patience. These are, of course, very important in care robots and social robots. And these are really encapsulated in Ross's 7 principles. But then we can also draw from human rights discourse and literature. So we can look at things like the right to privacy, the right to dignity, equality, and non-discrimination, and then also welfare rights, so social and environmental well-being. These are all human rights, which we all, of course, have. And then other principles would include safety, accuracy, and reliability. So these are a vast, huge array of principles upon which we draw our work. And so where would we find them? Well, the sources of the principles really are also all over the show, but there is some sort of framework that you can try and develop. And the first one would be, of course, international human rights frameworks. So things such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which set out a lot of human rights. And then domestic or national legislation, such as the EU or the UK GDPR, which of course informs AI, because of course data is a very, very integral to part of artificial intelligence. So we would look at any kind of legislation or statute that informs AI and informs data would of course form part of that. But then also the newly proposed EU AI Act. There's a new US Algorithmic Accountability Act. And of course, and it's funny enough, in the US, they've just introduced a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which also set out 5 principles. So these principles are sort of all over the show, and they're very much available. And we would, of course, look at all those instruments to inform us. But then, because we are not only looking at legal concerns and legal rules, we're also looking at ethics. So we could look at ethical theories, so utilitarianism and consequentialism and virtue ethics, etc., but also high-level ethics guidance and frameworks. So we have the EU high-level expert group of AI. I'm sure we've all heard about that, which set out 3 different pillars of trustworthy AI. And then the IEEE, UNESCO, OECD principles of AI, they've all done a lot of work on this. In fact, there are over 150 different ethics guidance documents out there. Some are industry specific, some are sector specific, but they all inform the principles that we might want to write about in our rules. We can also look at codes of conduct and protocols and standards, technical and design principles, so things such as, privacy by design, ethics by in through design. And then because we look at social and cultural rules and principles as well, we might be informed by religious doctrines, customs, cultural and social texts, and then the community would also inform us. So there would be community input, engagement, community leaders, domain experts, and just actually members of the public. They would all, we could look at all those sources essentially to find our principles. Quite a few. Okay, so that's the first step. Remember, we said the first step was to identify what these principles might be, and we have set about to establish that there are a plurality of principles. And now the second stage is to try and reduce these high-level principles somewhat to something that is more manageable. So this informs our second stage, which is to map proxies to system capabilities. And this consists of 3 separate stages within the stage. And the first one is to reframe these principles as either proxies or placeholders. And by doing this, we narrow the scope of the normative principle within the context. So if we talk about a proxy or placeholder, we describe it as the actionable form that is used to represent the value of the underlying principle. So for example, if we talk about respect for autonomy, a proxy for that might be something like consent or assent or granting or withholding information or giving an instruction that all informs the principle of respect for autonomy. And then something like privacy and privacy right, it may be 2 separate issues of privacy, the one being an intrusion into your personal space, and the second one might be some kind of notion of informational privacy, so good data stewardship. So privacy, again, we've now almost set out 2 different aspects of what we mean by privacy. So in other words, we're trying to really unpack what these high-level principles mean within the context. And after we've done the reframing of these into these proxies, what we do is we establish the system capabilities, and then we map the capabilities to the proxies, because we can only write a rule about a principle if the system has the capability or functionality to do something about it. And then we establish links and dependencies between these. And then the end of the second stage is to write preliminary rules. Okay, so what is very important in this stage, actually this is stage 2, but anyway, is to really have a look, and maybe part of stage 1 as well, is to really have a look at the context and the capabilities, because that can lead to very different conclusions about how a principle is relevant. And so we consider the context. So for example, in a healthcare or within a home or a hospital and a care bot, writing a specific rule and the way in which the principle applies in that rule will look very different to an application in another industry, such as in finance or industry or manufacturing, for example. So let's have a look at the way in which we would do this in assisted care dressing, in our assisted care dressing example. So if we, for example, are going to reframe the principles, what we might say in an assisted care dressing scenario is firstly that we could identify privacy as an issue, respect for autonomy as an issue, and then not doing harm or preventing any kind of harm to either physically or mentally to the user. So we've now identified these 3 principles, and what we've done is we've created these proxies. So in other words, we've said for privacy, we can look at data protection and we can look at intrusion into personal space. For respect for autonomy, we can have a look at a proxy of perhaps granting and withholding consent. And then harm, we can divide into physical and mental harm. So basically, we're looking at the context and the environment, and we're asking what might the principle mean within this context. And we identify then these proxies and these principles. In other words, we reduce and scope and establish the essence of what the principle means within this particular scenario. And we establish firstly the scope and the context of the principle within the context. And then we also try and find the essential obligation owed to the user by specifying the context, the content of the particular obligations or duties. So that is essentially what we're doing when we reframe these principles as these proxies. Okay, so once we've done that, we then have to map them to the capabilities. So we set about to set out what these capabilities are, and we may see that, in fact, the capabilities of the machine is to control the curtains or control the lights, or maybe it's got some voice recognition, or it can ask and answer questions. So we basically set about to capture what the capabilities or functionality of the autonomous system may be in that situation. And then we see how, because we cannot obviously write a rule about a principle if we don't have the system capability. So embedding these principles into the rule will be limited or informed by the system functionality. And so we have to map the principles to the particular capabilities. And this is what we do at that stage. And then at the end of stage 2, we write the preliminary rules. So just as an example, with our assisted care dressing example, we might write a rule that says something like, when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, then the robot should open the curtains. Simple rule, preliminary rule. It really is just obeying an instruction, and it's opening the curtains. That's it. But we can write other rules as well, but we'll just unpack that first rule because we'll just as an illustration to see how this whole thing works. But we can write other rules. So we can write rules about data protection. We can write rules about when the robot cannot find a garment, then tell the robot should inform the user, or when the user is distressed and the user is fully dressed, then support should be called using a video. So we can write preliminary rules at this stage. Basically, this is the first type of rule, which we then build upon. So once we've done that, we now go into stage 3, okay? And stage 3 is actually quite a simple, quick stage. And basically what we do in stage 3 is we identify SLEEC concerns. So remember, SLEEC is social, legal, ethical, empathetic, and cultural. And basically how we describe a SLEEC concern is a point of impact within the system process that directly and potentially adversely affects the SLEEC norm so that it's a cause of concern. Okay, and we can rely on various tools and methods that are currently being developed, like impact assessments to establish like data protection impacts and human rights impacts and fairness and measures to try and capture bias and fairness and whatnot. So basically, essentially at this stage, we're just really identifying what these SLEEC concerns may be. And then once we've established what they are, so let's just have a look at our example of our first rule, which is when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, the robot should open the curtains. So that's a single rule, but it may be associated with multiple concerns. And these are the concerns. So we've already said that there are certain normative concerns or touch points, one of which might be privacy, one of which might be respect for autonomy, dignity, or explainability. So these are some of the principles that might impact this particular rule, but we can identify at least 2, and that is the issue about privacy and the issue about respect for autonomy. So once we've established that there are, in fact, SLEEC concerns, or what they might be, then we move on to the next stage, which is stage 4, where we ascertain whether there are, in fact, any SLEEC conflicts, and we try and resolve these conflicts. And this is where some of the newer work has been done, which I will get into. So let's have a look at, for example, our preliminary rule, which was when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, then the robot should open the curtains. So remember, we've now got 2 principles. We have autonomy and we have respect for privacy, because in opening the curtains, we may compromise privacy. So we then ask, under what circumstances would this not hold? Would this rule not hold? And just to describe how we define a SLEEC conflict here, so there's quite a lot of talking, so I need a sip of water. If we think that the way we sort of set this up is that we understand that there are plural normative principles, so there are very many normative principles. So really, it shouldn't come as any surprise then that these norms may bump into each other. In other words, and that is how we describe a conflict or a tension which may arise between the principles. So the principles may then sometimes be seen to either be competing or rivals. And by normative conflict, we describe it in the following way. So we say that there's an action A and there's an action B, and we ought to perform both action A and action B, but under the circumstances, we can't do both. So for example, we ought to respect privacy and we ought to respect autonomy, but sometimes it's impossible to do both. And that's often a case when you have pluralistic principles. They do bump into each other and they do conflict. So this conflict has to then be resolved. So how do we go about doing that? We assess the principles and we ask which of these values or which of these principles is more important or more prominent or more salient within the context. And this requires negotiated, justifiable trade-offs, as only one interest or value can be maximized or selected within the context. Obviously, if you can select more than one and you can easily apply more than one, then you just write a rule about all of them. But if they conflict, or if they are in tension, then you have to select one above the other, and you have to write that within the rule. So in other words, we have to manage this normative conflict. And the way in which we resolve it is we resolve the conflicts using defeaters. So defeaters essentially are the hedging clauses, which is the unless portion of the rule. So we set out the conditions or the circumstances under which the principle or the rule does not apply. And then we generate a complex rule, in other words, the preliminary rule plus single or multiple defeaters that set out what these conditions may be, and we embed that within the rule. And that's how we manage these conflicts. Right. So if we have a look at our rule, where we've now written a semi-complex rule. We've written a rule with a hedge. So we've said when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, then the robot should open the curtains. Unless the user is undressed, then the robot should tell the user, you cannot open the curtains because you're undressed. Okay, so what we can see now is we actually have 4 principles at play. We have autonomy, which is the instruction when the user tells the robot, okay? We have the robot should open the curtains, but that may compromise privacy. And then we have the user, unless the user is undressed, then tell the user you cannot open the curtains while undressed. So we have a principle about explainability or transparency because the robot's telling the user something. But by the robot telling the user, I can't open the curtains, it may in fact compromise the user's mental integrity, or it may compromise their mental health because they may get so aggravated or annoyed by the robot doing what they're doing that it may compromise their mental health. So that's a principle around non-maleficence. So we have 4 principles, and under the circumstances, all 4 cannot be satisfied. So we need to go about or set about to resolve this conflict. Okay, so this is some of the newer work. So essentially what we're doing now is when we've set up, as we've set up these SLEEC conflicts, these require trade-offs between the conflicting norms, which amounts to selecting from alternatives with a moral dimension, which is what we've described. But what we do is we are non-prioritist in our approach. So this is in the sense that we do not initially rank the principles. So we do not say, like some authors have said, or some, and that is that, for example, respect for autonomy should be always given a place of honor or ranked prima inter pares, in other words, first amongst equals, above the other principles. Although on resolving the conflict, a priority or an ordering may arise, both in the principles and in the reasons. But when we start off, we say that no single rational complete ordering of the principles can be reduced or deduced a priori. So we don't rank them up front. And the reason for this is because we believe that the context and the content dictates the ranking of the principle. So there may be a trivial gain in one principle versus an enormous sacrifice in another. And we believe that all principles are in and of themselves valuable to some extent, only that we don't know how valuable they are within a given context. And that's what we want to do when we resolve these conflicts. So what we need to set about doing is really to manage this moral choice. And we want to try and use some kind of choice modeling to do this. And this may involve various techniques, including weighing and balancing, but it may also include things such as a traditional cost-benefit analysis, some kind of moral choice theory, and indeed something called a quantum choice modeling. So these are the various mechanisms we may use to be able to actually try and resolve these this moral conflict or these normative conflicts. So let's see, firstly, the first way of maybe perhaps dealing with this is to use a traditional cost-benefit analysis model to resolve normative conflict. And in certain circumstances, it can be used, and I'll show you how. So, for example, if we write a rule that says when information is requested by a third party, then just disclose this personal information to the requesting party. So we have two normative conflicts. The one is the principle around accessibility of information or transparency. And then the second part is the informational privacy aspect, in other words, data protection law. So let's see how we can resolve this conflict using a traditional cost-benefit analysis. And we would do it quite simply by saying we're going to really position in conflict data privacy versus data accessibility. And we're going to look through the single criterion or the lens of monetary cost or financial cost. And what we might come to see then is if we do look at these two, we may draw the conclusion that the potential for a fine for violating data protection law outweighs the cost of allowing access to the personal data. And therefore, we may find that, in fact, we would rather not give access to the information, and we would rather uphold data protection law. And therefore, it's an easy way to resolve this conflict based on a simple traditional cost-benefit analysis. So in some scenarios, it works really well. But as we will see, in some scenarios, it doesn't work well at all. And that is when we start trading off qualitative elements. So if we use let's try and use the same cost-benefit analysis, but using, for example, a choice scenario which involves either saving a dog's life versus preventing harm to an autonomous vehicle. And if we look through the same lens of financial economic cost, we might come to the conclusion that from just purely practical reasons, we don't necessarily have a solution that we're all happy with. Because how do we firstly value the dog's life? And while a traditional cost-benefit analysis might work really well in certain cases, in certain situations, it almost certainly might fail. So we may then come to the realization that the value of the dog's life cannot be mathematically quantified, because everybody has their own view of how much the dog is worth to them personally, and you can't necessarily express that in some kind of monetary value. I mean, some people can, but many people can't. So what we're essentially doing in this situation is we're comparing incommensurable objects. So we're considering whether a line is longer than a stone is heavy, and it's quite difficult to do that when we use a single value such as financial gain or financial cost. So what we need to really ask is there a common currency against which gains and losses of value can be computed? And so we find that values and norms are not only plural and potentially conflicting, but in a very real sense, they may also be incommensurable. Okay, so if we express it in a slightly different way, and we have a look again at the dog's life versus damage to the vehicle, we might set it out as follows. So we might say that if the importance of the satisfaction in saving the dog's life, so in other words, principle one, is greater than the degree of non-satisfaction in damaging the car, in other words, principle two, then arguably we might have some kind of justifiable reason for selecting principle one. But how do we measure the importance of satisfying the gain or satisfying principle one against the non-satisfaction of principle two or the loss? So even if we do not have a common value to calculate their weight necessarily, what we still believe you can do, and we can still be guided to do, is to collect reasons to prefer one principle above another. And so when we talk about valuing or balancing, what is really meant is it's meant in a metaphorical sense. So not in comparing weights necessarily, but it makes reference to the exercise of assessing the underlying reasons that inform the choice. And we can see how that might play out. I'll show you an example on how that might play out. But before we do that, essentially when we look at the resolving of these, identifying and resolving these conflicts, what we really need to set out to do is to answer the following non-trivial questions. And the first one is really, is there one currency in terms of which each conflict of principles can be resolved? And then is it true that for each conflict of values, there might be some third value, independent or not of the two conflicting values, which we can appeal to in order to resolve the conflict? And then the last question really is to ask, can a conflict of principles or values ever be rationally resolved? And I mean, we can't get away from that last question. So, you know, if some overall comparison must be made, and in a sense, if we do need to just bite the bullet and make some kind of, you know, come to some way of resolving the conflict. And if we must adjudicate the conflicting claims, then should it be by appealing to some kind of third value or a number of third or different values or other values or extra values as a currency to count as a way of measuring or as an arbiter of the conflicting principles, thereby creating the reasons, okay, for resolving the conflict one way or another. And we believe that this is probably one way to go. So let's see how we can capture then these reasons that will either count for or against a particular choice. And I'll use an example to do that. So let's use another rule, which will illustrate this, I hope. And that is, we can just ask a simple question, a simple rule such as, when the user refuses medicine, then medicine should not be administered. So that sounds kind of reasonable, okay? Except, so what we're doing in this rule is we upholding, respecting autonomy. But in doing that, we may in fact cause harm. And the second principle that perhaps is implied, if not explicitly implied, specifically stated, is that we want to prevent harm as well. So we really need to find out, how do we manage the conflict between respecting autonomy, in other words, doing what the user says in this case, and preventing harm by administering the medication. So let's see how we can capture some of these reasons. And what we might do, okay, I know it looks kind of like, well, interesting with the star chart, but what we might want to do is we might want to really, in a sense, capture the reasons why we might prefer respecting autonomy versus preventing harm. And let's use a choice scenario where the patient refuses to take their medicine, but their medicine is insulin. Okay, so now what we do is we set about, okay, to identify various features or factors or criteria that inform this choice. In other words, these are the justifiable reasons that inform our choice. And these could be, firstly, the importance of the principle, the relative importance of the principle within the context, the severity of the consequences or what repercussions there may be of non-performance, and then perhaps even the reliability of the assumptions or of the certainty of the outcome. But we can add to these, so we can add other features. So perhaps even financial cost is one, okay? But what we're trying to suggest is that there are many reasons that inform this choice, not just one. And in these more complex scenarios, we might want to capture more reasons to try and inform our choice. And in a simple star chart such as this, we might be able to see from our stakeholders that in fact it's a very clear winner, that there are way more stars at the bottom. And in fact, when the patient refuses to take their medicine and the medicine happens to be insulin, then we should certainly prevent harm by either not obeying the instruction and either calling support or taking some other action and going down a course of action that in fact prevents harm. So that's a very clear outcome just based on just using these more nuanced criteria. But let's use exactly the same scenario. But in this case, we also want to capture say a scenario where the patient refuses to take their medicine, but in this case the medicine is not insulin, it's something just like a simple vitamin tablet, so vitamin B12. Okay, and now we provide these are the reasons for justification upon which, and also an explanation for why a particular choice would be selected, and we use the same criteria. And in this situation where the medicine is in fact just a simple vitamin tablet, we may come to a completely different conclusion. And that is, in this situation, we can respect autonomy. So if the patient doesn't want to take the vitamin pills, it's actually fine, because the prevention of harm in this situation might be quite minimal or insignificant. And therefore, in this case, we can in fact respect autonomy. And for that reason, we then come to a completely different outcome, just by creating more nuance in the reasons and the weighting of the reasons. So in a sense, this is how the reasons really inform the ranking of the principles, and they inform the priority, in fact, of the principles. And this choice data, if we capture it from our stakeholders or whoever, then what we can do is we can use that as input into some kind of quantum choice model or other type of model, which can really ascertain the preferred selected choice in the context. And that can then inform the way in which the rule is written and the outcome at the end of the day. But what we do also caution is that it may not be as simple as simply just tallying up these scores. Some literature has been written about this. I mean, it's not a matter of just doing a list of pros and cons and just adding them up. Some may need to be weighted slightly differently, and they may need to be manipulated or in different ways. So we're exploring what those ways might be. So essentially, this is some of our preliminary thoughts about how we can set to really try and resolve these normative conflicts. Okay, and then once we've done that, our last stage is to refine the rules. So based on the outcome of the resolution of the normative conflicts, we then write ever more complex rules, including the preliminary rule plus single or multiple defeaters. And then we also label the rule. So we can label them as social, legal, ethical, empathetic, or cultural. Some of them may have more than one label, because a legal rule written about privacy will look very different to a cultural rule written about privacy. So it might be nice to actually be able to label them. And then we can account for their impact. So we can say, if we use this defeater, it has a positive impact on privacy, a negative impact on explainability, or it has a neutral impact on one of the principles. So we can kind of start gathering information about what our actual rules mean and how they impact the relevant principles. And then we reassess the rules. So that's the final part of the stage where we actually loop back around, but I'll show you that as well. So we consider the impact, be it positive, negative, or neutral. And we also look at the severity of the impact. So maybe the impact of a negative consequence from a particular principle may be severe or not severe at all, or insignificant, in fact. And as I say, we label them. And then the last thing we do is, once we've created this refinement of the rules by writing these complex rules, in doing so, interestingly enough, we may want to loop back around and re-look at the SLEEC concerns, because in creating the rule, we might create other problems which uncover further SLEEC concerns, and then which one would then need to be again resolved and write ever more complex rules. And we keep doing this until we have no more SLEEC concerns to deal with, and then the process happily comes to an end. So I'll show you how, just using our first example about the robot and the curtains, how we loop back around and address the further SLEEC concern. So let's say we have the rule, when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, the robot opens the curtains, and then we write the first defeater, which is unless the user is undressed, then the robot tells the user, you cannot open the curtains while you're undressed. And then we describe what the impacts might be. But in doing that, we may create a further problem, because remember we said that if the robot tells the user, I'm not opening the curtains, the user might become very agitated, and it may affect their mental health. So this gives rise to a new SLEEC concern, which we didn't think of initially. And so we have to set about to resolve that. And we resolve that as we've done over and over again, which is to write another defeater. So what we say then is we say when the user tells the robot to open the curtains, the robot should open the curtains. Unless the user's undressed, then the robot tells the user you can't open the curtains while you're undressed. But then if we see, unless again, the user is highly distressed or agitated, in which case just open the curtains, because what we're essentially saying now is we're saying that their mental health trumps all the other principles, and therefore we want to in fact just simply open the curtains if they're going to be distressed about it. And even if that means, but you see, this is the whole idea with the trade-offs. If you're going to do that, then you're going to have to trade off privacy because the curtains are going to be open. But we, or the stakeholders, have resolved that conflict, and they have decided that in the circumstances, it's worth doing that or worth doing something else. So that would come from the input of the stakeholders. And then what we do is we essentially just write, we've just set out really in tables, exactly how we would set out the preliminary rule, the ordering of the rule, the defeaters, the impacts, and their labeling. And we can just write a whole series of rules, really, and just build up a bank of rules that really address SLEEC, really address the SLEEC concerns and resolve the SLEEC conflicts. And essentially, that is really the end. So essentially what we're doing there is we're really bridging the gap between the high level principles and then the rules. And we've just written we've just shown you or demonstrated how in fact we can go about to do that. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bev, for a inspiring talk, and thank you for so resiliently coping with technology problems. Right, so questions for Bev? Right, so Colin and then Ariana.
Yeah, no, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting stuff there. So with this SLEEC setup, is this under the assumption that whatever stakeholders you provide this to will have some sort of unified idea of what's going on at the very least? Because I mean, I'm thinking about the medical example and the discussions that we've had where there are very opposing views, for example. But can SLEEC work even if, let's say, that collection of stakeholders have very opposing views? Will it ever try to find a balance between the two, or would that balance actually end up being the worst, I suppose, of both worlds in this instance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. Thank you. You know, I think the selection of the stakeholders is very important, but I also think the way in which the stakeholders deliberate, really. So I think that's why it's a negotiated trade-off with interested parties that are involved, you know, in the particular application. So a small grouping of some kind of deliberative, participatory activity or engagement. And I mean, I think if you read our paper, we actually do say that in some cases, you know, we don't anticipate that everything will necessarily be resolved. I mean, ideally, we would like it to be resolved, but in certain cases, we may not reach consensus, and that also will impact the rule. I mean, we're not suggesting we're not saying what the rule should be. It's for the stakeholders at the end of the day to describe and to write, in a sense, the rules and the content of the rules. So we're just creating the process by which they can achieve this. But absolutely, I mean, it is down to the stakeholders at the end of the day to give the information and to provide the input in terms of not only what rules need to be written, but how they need to be written and how they resolve the conflicts. So, I mean, you know, that is a part of any sort of like deliberative engagement type stakeholder activity where people just simply may, in certain circumstances, not agree, and then, I mean, that's just something that has to be dealt with or lived with at that point. But certainly, I mean, I think it's definitely a very interesting question in terms of how we frame the stakeholder engagement and how we select stakeholders, and exactly their role in the way in which they come to some kind of consensus, if they can.
I think we agreed quite a number of times that there is value in not agreeing on a set of rules, because that means not deploying a system that will ultimately generate harm, right? So there is not a problem if agreement is not reached when we know.
In fact, it's to be anticipated that, especially if you're drawing from a diverse base of stakeholders, that through that sort of dialogical process, that maybe they sometimes won't agree.
Yeah. Ariana?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, cool, thank you. Yeah, I had a similar question about resolving conflicts. Maybe I'll start from the other. I have two questions. So it's all about, so you said that these rules should be developed at design stage. And I was wondering though, did you go through an example from top to bottom? So could you answer all the questions at design stage? Because I feel like from similar exercises that I've done at Bristol, we are also part of TAS. It's very difficult to answer some of these questions about what a robot should do at design stage, because the answer depends a lot on implementation of the technology. Unless you're saying that at design stage means that you have the technology ready and then you do the ethics exercise. But then my objection to that would be that I guess it would be interesting to see whether some ethical principles and rules that are developed then should inform a redesign of the technology, maybe changes in the design of the technology. So yeah, I was just wondering whether, first of all, whether you did an exercise with one technology from the start to the end, and you were able to develop all kinds of ethics rules and resolve all kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, I think to answer it quite simply is that, I mean, the idea is that it's not to create or to anticipate every scenario and to do everything. And that's why I think what we're suggesting is that it's only somewhat SLEEC aware and somewhat SLEEC compliant. And it's very much limited by whatever the rules are written, you know, at design stage, and what can be anticipated based on the capacity of the machine and the capabilities of the machine at that point in time. So
yeah, but then wouldn't you want to
narrow? It's got a very narrow scope, but absolutely, if you eventually find that in deployment that the rules perhaps are redundant or irrelevant, or whatever, that they may need to be redesigned or relooked at, and there is definitely that possibility. Okay. But the idea is only really to be able to write some kind of SLEEC sensitive rules to some extent in a very narrowly framed and tightly bounded, constrained situation, and to be able to see what the stakeholders may be able to anticipate, and then perhaps write some rules around that. I mean, that really is, I mean, I'm very interested to hear if we could perhaps develop it further, of course, but for the moment, that's pretty much the way that the process would work.
Thank you. And then very quickly, my second question. So it was also about, you know, again, resolving conflicts. So you gave the example of the curtains, and then the other one about a medical context where someone doesn't want a medication. But like in a clinic, I would think that if someone doesn't want, even if it's a life-saving medication, if that person has capacity, then they would be allowed to make that decision.
Of course.
Well, it seemed that from the example that you gave, if it was a life-saving medication, then you would rank preventing harm above autonomy, while if it was about a vitamin that would be the other way around.
Okay,
So
just to respond to that quick before you go on, I mean that's just a simple example, okay, of how and how they can be manipulated one way or the other. But all that information would be captured by the stakeholders at design time. So in other words, they would anticipate that, and they would certainly look at does the person have legal capacity? What would the implications of that be? And those would be informing the choice. So it's really just a mechanism to come to find a preferable choice in the scenario, but it would be completely dependent upon whatever the stakeholders, who would then be the medical practitioners, the legal advisors, the consultants, whoever it may be in that case, to advise in terms of how the rules should be written so that they are in fact legally compliant.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. No, I was just wondering.
Very different. That's just an example of a rule. It may in practice look very different.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for clarifying that. I was just wondering whether you could envision like something similar that goes much more onto a personalized level. So the decision is not made at stakeholder level, but there is a potential for individual users of the technology to design the rules themselves. So it's an additional level, I guess. Or maybe I was wondering whether maybe this example of life-saving versus not life-saving medication points to a broader criticism that perhaps these kind of decisions shouldn't be left to robots in a way. It's so complex that you would need to add so many unless statements that maybe
In fact, in most of those scenarios, it would really be a call support, more likely than not, to be honest. And they would defer that the actual ethical and moral decision making would probably be deferred. But to the extent that they can make minor ethical type decisions, then perhaps this is a mechanism of being able to do that.
Yeah.
But also, I think, which is quite important, which is what you kind of perhaps alluding to, and that is the fact that it is quite worthwhile to, in fact, also have users in that stakeholder group.
Yeah.
So they might be able to, so that you can capture many different types of users with very different scenarios and then write rules about them. So it may not be that the rules necessarily apply to everybody, but that you actually further refine the rules in a way that is more tailored to specific users. But it's quite likely that a vast number of rules will eventually end up being written, which that's just sort of at the moment the way it's sort of set up.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, that like a key point is to gather a representative or diverse group of stakeholders, which per se it's already a very difficult task to achieve.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
Thank you. Without its complications, there's no doubt.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I haven't had the chance to read the paper, but I will. Thank you.
Well, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me or whatever. I'd be quite interested to hear.
So do you have another?
Thank you.
Bev, in case we can take another question or two. Are you happy to answer another question or two, Bev?
No, sure. I'm happy to answer as many.
Maybe, so since we started a bit late, so I realize some people may need to leave. So would you like to ask your questions now?
Yeah, very shortly. So I was just asking Bev, thank you for the presentation, by the way. So would you agree that adding new defeaters sometimes can cause new conflicts while solving the others? Because we have.
No, I agree with that. I think that is part of the process, in the sense that you need a lot of stakeholder engagement to really unpack and unpick exactly what affects what. And the way in which the defeaters are positioned and written obviously requires a lot of thought and a lot of manipulation, really, in terms of getting the conflicts really resolved properly. But the understanding is that we would be trying to do it with the rule, and then using defeasible logic and defeaters to try and set out the conditions upon which the original rule wouldn't hold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tim?
No, thanks very much. No, I was very interested in Ariana's question and the responses, but I think that's all been addressed. My other question relates to one of the basic premises right at the start, I think, and that is the question of whether rules can be devised to cover every situation. I'm personally somewhat skeptical of that, and yet business-to-business computer decision systems like hiring systems or systems for vetting CVs and the like, and many other things have been attempts to do that. And you see that also in company rules and all other things. One of the things I've tended to believe for a while is that at some point you have to build in how shall I put this, an intervention by management. So in some ways, is there an allowance in this process for when it needs to get flagged up to a supervisor for a resolution?
Yeah, I mean, I think that can be built into the rules. In fact, I mean, as I was saying previously, like more often than not, you're probably going to have to defer, especially the hardest sort of moral conflict questions, and even some of the simpler ones, perhaps, to a supervisor, or to, escalate it up to an actual human. So I mean, that's part of moral choice. I mean, it's not a moral choice machine, and it's certainly not any kind of moral machine in any sense of the word. So I agree with you completely. I mean, I don't think we envisaged that it was going to be making very difficult, hard moral choices necessarily, but only to say that we are trying to devise a way in which it can make introduce some moral decision making, or some moral component or SLEEC component into the writing of rules. But certainly I agree with you completely. I mean, I don't think that machines should be positioned to make really hard moral choices necessarily. And there's a lot that it certainly will not be able to do. But hopefully some of the sort of legal rules that are quite easy to embed, it should be able to do that and function quite well doing it. So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a solve all for all moral conflict and all moral decision making at all. I mean, we understand that.
No, thanks for that. I agree. I understand the value in what you're trying to achieve. Don't get me wrong on that. And I thought it was a really interesting presentation and the way you built it up. And obviously it's an incredibly complex subject. So I really thought, it was an excellent presentation, and I don't mean to sound patronizing. Thanks very much for it. Really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback.
No, can I add briefly that there is an analogy here with how risk management is carried out? Again, we are not going for any system that we deploy to exhaustively assess every single possible risk. But yeah, that's to be seen. Thank you. Colin, last question.
Thank you. So just adding on to that and leading into my question, one of the things is that we certainly don't intend that we could ever argue about everything, but one of the things that's obviously limiting in this, in terms of what we can argue about, is the capabilities of the platform. So we can only ever argue about what is capable of the platform. So what are your thoughts, Bev, on how this process should then lead to what should change about a platform, rather than as saying, this is a fixed robot and now we reason about it? Yeah.
Interesting question, Colin. So in fact, what you can say then is, if we need to write a particular rule about a particular legal or ethical issue, that perhaps we can design a system that is capable of being able to express such a rule. Is that what I mean, I think there is value in that. I think there's tremendous value in perhaps doing that. And maybe it can also help in terms of assisting in the design of the autonomous system at the end of the day. So, I mean, and to capture some of those things. So if, for example, you need consent, or you'd like to get respect autonomy and get consent, and maybe you can build within the system a capability that could potentially do that. So it could also inadvertently help the actual other requirements in terms of the design, which might also be helpful. So absolutely, agree with you.
Thank you.
Right, thanks very much again, Bev, for the insightful presentation and very interesting answers. And thank you everyone for attending, and see you in 2 weeks' time for our next seminar. Bye now.